The task of perfecting our union moves forward.
Kick it!
We want our children to live in America that isn't burdened by debt, that isn't weakened by inequality,
The Joe Show
that isn't threatened by the destructive power of a warming planet.
on AM 930 Progressive Talk, KBAI.
Well, good Tuesday. It is Northwest Washington's only local live liberal progressive program here on the progressive voice of the Pacific Northwest. AM 930 Progressive Talk, KBAI. And what we feared would happen has come to pass. There was not an indictment in the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The officer will not be charged. And there was violence last night. There was even a tad bit of violence, I guess you could say, in Seattle, but in other cities as well. Now, even today, there are high school students, Roosevelt High School students, marching in solidarity with the Brown family and people who are outraged or at least upset that there will be no legal charges, apparently, criminal charges brought in this case. But how do we move forward? You know, we have this conversation time and again, it seems, and how do we face this together? We all look at these kinds of incidents and situations through, jaded through the lens of our lives, our experiences, who we are, and it makes it difficult rather for us to all see it in the same light. And my guest now has, actually before this announcement was made, there was a video made of a presentation that he gave, a short presentation, but a very powerful one called It's Hunting Season. And Dr. Derek Greenfield joins us here on the program. Dr. Greenfield, great to have you on the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and most importantly, for the great work you do and your station for Progressive Talk.
Thanks a lot. And I told you off the air I was very impressed with the video of your talk. I guess could I call it a sermon maybe, or?
Well, it was a spoken word piece, so it's
Yeah.
poetry, but it certainly, I think, lends itself to a lot of different narrative forms.
But what I was impressed with was how you took this very ugly thing, which I see as, and you expressed in, it's hunting season on young men of color primarily, and it's what we do see in society. And we've seen incident after incident. In that piece, you referenced Trayvon Martin, but this has happened, and you referenced many others as well. But
Sure.
You seem to use even the tragedy of those deaths as inspiration to move forward in a positive way. Am I kind of getting your gist?
Well, sure. It's to raise awareness. It stemmed from about a week ago. I had a speaking engagement in Mississippi, and people reminded me it's deer season. I looked up online to find out about hunting season, and I saw all these rules and regulations that were designed to protect deer. And I thought it's been hunting season in the lives of brown and black men in this country for a long time. Mm-hmm. And where are the rules to protect them? And so that was the metaphor that I came up with, but to have people be aware of what this may feel like for folks who feel like they're under attack or potentially victimized at any particular time. So we may not have gotten an indictment in terms of the officer yesterday, but certainly we should be seeing this as an indictment of a system right now that continues to devalue the lives of brown and black men. And even just the narrative that goes on around the incidents that happened last night, certainly. I don't want to minimize or say anything positive about the burning or looting and destruction, but at the same time, we have to remember the only person dead since all this took place in Ferguson is Mike Brown. And so we need to be able to have a movement, not just a moment. Sometimes when these situations emerge, and that was my hope with the piece, to spark some conversation, to get people thinking about that, these tragedies often get people sparked, but they either burn up or burn out very quickly. How do we long-term doing it? And really what I wanted us to do is to be hunters for the greatness of young men of color. I spent last night at a spoken word place here in New York City and shared my piece. And I looked around at these brilliant, wonderfully talented young men, predominantly young men of color, all sharing their talents. And all I wanted to do was to hug them and say, I love you and I believe in you. And I think we need to be hunters for the greatness of young men who are often villainized and victimized in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and an excellent point that you made just a moment ago about the only person who has lost their life in this whole situation is Michael Brown, an 18-year-old man. I mean, technically by the law, but most of us think of 18 as a boy, and and to lose his life at such a young age and in such a violent way, and this does happen over and over again. I would say you're absolutely right. When we hear about an incident like this, it's almost just considered normal because it's the way things have been for so long.
And indeed, that narrative, we have to change it. And I'm so proud of young people in this country for using social media, for expressing their voices and taking action and saying that it's time for us to assume our rightful place as young people in changing the discussion and getting people to really see what's been going on. You know, it's amazing. People run into the White House and they end up alive, but Trayvon and Mike Brown run away from folks and get killed. Yeah. And so I think, and I don't want to just simply say this is an isolated incident. There's Fergusons all over this country. And this is happening far more often than people realize. And there's also the microaggressions, the daily encounters that particularly young men of color or people of color in general face. The indignities of privilege that is not expressed to them, the kind of negative treatment that happens, a system, not just individual acts of meanness, but systemic racism that is prevalent throughout our society. So hopefully this can be, again, we keep thinking it'll be the moment, but hopefully we can just sort of build up moments here that can awaken dominant society to say, maybe things aren't just the way we thought they were. Mm-hmm. And we can be honest and have some conversations and really challenge ourselves to look at this. And it's also going to mean that those who've been marginalized, perhaps there'll just be another spark to take full advantage of the political process. You know, this prosecutor was there because he was voted in. You know, the police force, that we only see 53 officers in Ferguson, only 3 are African American. There's a problem here systemically, that people would take action and really start with voting, with speaking out, with raising some heck once in a while. Perhaps, again, we can see transformations in the structures of our society and trickle down to our individual conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's good that people do speak out, that they do take to the streets, that they make their voices heard. I guess the problem comes whenever there is a gathering like that, we do have an element that shows up that does want to create mayhem, that sees it as an opportunity to riot, to cause problems, to bring violence. And how do we get past that? How do we deal with that in our midst?
I think 2 things. One, we recognize, as Dr. King reminded us, a riot is the language of the unheard. So there's so many folks that are saying this may be the only voice. Now, also recognize there is a small segment that was doing some pretty heinous stuff. Burning buildings, especially community institutions, and that were burned. And so it's deeply problematic. But sometimes when people feel that they have no other way to express themselves, they may act out in ways that go against their best interests and their best selves. But let's keep our eyes on the prize. There's the majority of the folks out there were focused on the right thing. The majority of the protesters who've been there for a long time are doing educational work and social justice initiatives and all kinds of programs in Ferguson to raise awareness and around the country. So if we get distracted and moved away, we begin to be complicit in the narrative that says, see, it's just a bunch of hooligans and thugs.
Yeah.
Just like all of us. We all have individual family members who are a little bit crazy, but that doesn't define our family.
Absolutely.
So we've got to make sure we keep the focus. I mean, some of us have more than others. But we got to keep the focus really where it is, which is those who are committed to the struggle in healthy, positive ways and in a constructive manner.
Yeah, I always think back to when my wife and I were living in Denver back in the 1990s when the Denver Broncos won the Super Bowl for the first time, and people went crazy, and there was rioting. There were cars overturned and burned, and this was a happy celebration. And so, from that though, the conclusion, I don't think anybody drew the conclusion that all Bronco fans are thugs and are out to destroy. It was just looked on as a few ne'er-do-wells that happened to be in the crowd that let things get too far or had too much to drink. But in a case like this, where people are sincerely worried and concerned about what's happening out on our streets and interacting with police, how the police view people of color, and they are sincerely worried about that and trying to make their voices heard in that regard, and then that they're considered to be the same as those who are smashing windows and looting.
And that's part of the issue of privilege that people need to recognize. That when whites act, they sort of get to represent just themselves, but when people of color are doing certain actions, they then sort of become emblematic of a group. And so this speaks to, right, it's a couple individuals. These are just some wild kids having a little fun, as opposed to seeing this as a problem among white youth. But yet, if it happens among a small segment of African American or Latino youth, then they get painted with a broad brush. And I think that's a deeply problematic aspect that people don't realize how that can happen. And it trickles down to give a concrete example in the classroom. You know, if a white student raises their hand in a class that's majority white, they get to be, you know, Sam or John or Sally. But if a student of color, maybe the only one of their particular group, raises the hand, there's that pressure to represent the entire group. Tell us what we should know about racism. And that burden of being on racial duty, I think, can be very difficult for so many folks. And so we need to personalize some of these examples well, so that people recognize that this is, not just happening to Mike Brown, unfortunately, in such tragedy, but every day, sort of microaggressions and mini tragedies take place which dehumanize people, and then they build up to where people feel like they have no other way to express themselves.
There is, I think, a stigma to being a person of color still to this day. You see, especially a young man. And young men, when I was young, and I'm the young white guy from a small town in Wisconsin, but when I was young, I felt that society viewed me as a danger to one degree or another. I wasn't a gangster. I was a musician, but and I had long hair and that sort of thing. But I did kind of have that sense that that people looked at me a little bit sideways, saying, well, what could this guy be bringing? But that, for a young man, a young African American man especially, that's amplified, infinite number of times, and it's just the way it is, and that's an attitude that I don't know how we can go about changing that. If it's like generational, through successive generations, that'll change.
And I think you raised a great example. And, of course, there's a difference between being looked at sideways and being looked at with fear.
Mm-hmm. And
so you experience a piece of that. But there's some great research by Philip Goff at UCLA and some of his colleagues who looked at the way in which children and young adolescents of different races are viewed by subjects in a study. And what they found was that black children are far less likely to be viewed as innocent. Sort of children. There's that little extra sort of fear factor. And they actually found that when they showed pictures of people that were suspected of doing some little criminal act, if the person were white and they were asked to guess the age, they were pretty accurate, how old that 13 or 15-year-old was. But on average, if it was an African-American person being looked at, they actually overshot it by 4.5 years. So here's folks who are looking at a 14-year-old and thinking they're 18, which automatically adultifies a child. And we know if you see you as an adult, you're less likely to be innocent, you're more likely to be sort of looked upon as suspicion. There's a whole bunch of unconscious biases. And this is a whole field of research now that people are looking at, that I don't believe most people in America, and particularly white folks or those in power, are evil and just don't like people of color or women or LGBT folk. But I do think that when you swim in polluted waters, a lot of it rubs off. And these unconscious biases, these narratives that play in our heads, that make us a little afraid when we see someone with a turban on a plane, that make us look a little bit scared if it's somebody who is a young black male walking in the street with his headphones on and a hoodie over his head, rather than just being a beautifully talented, creative young person. So if people would look at their biases and really have open and honest conversations, I think the worst thing in the world for someone to be is to be called racist or sexist. So we're afraid to admit we got stuff. We can do it. We just got to recognize we all have it. Even those of us in the social justice community, I've got them too, and I work daily at addressing those biases that take place. We've got to have those open and honest conversations with ourselves and each other to recognize we're not evil, we're just works in progress.
We're talking with Dr. Derek Greenfield. He's a speaker, consultant, thought leader. I like that. The Answer is in Your Hands is his motivational book. And we've got a caller here on the line bringing into the conversation. Bill in Fairhaven, welcome to the program. You're on with Dr. Greenfield.
Thank you. I may be a little off topic. I've been just thinking about this from the point of view of the specifics of the case. You know, there's really large social issues involved, obviously. But what I haven't heard yet, and I haven't read all the evidence, is this gentleman fired 12 shots at an unarmed teenager. He was hit at the car. He fired 10 more times. I haven't heard anybody ask how far was the officer from this boy in broad daylight that he had to fire 10 more times to stop him. And 2 of the shots were entry wounds from above, which means the boy was falling over, forward. How can you possibly say that was a justifiable homicide? So I may be a little off the social thing, but I think critically looking at the evidence, there's no way you can justify shooting this kid 8 times.
Well, that's an impression that I got from the very beginning, was that it seemed to be way overboard. Now, I've seen other video now since this happened that has been posted of other police shootings and police shootings that of young black men. There's one, and I don't know what city this was shot in, but apparently it was a dashboard cam, a police dashboard cam that caught this and showed the officer rolling, following this car. The car pulled into a driveway. The cop car came right up behind, and the police officer got out immediately. And as the subject made a move to get back in the car or something like that, this guy just unleashed a volley of gunshots at him and killed him right there on the spot. It was horrible to watch, and but it just seems that is kind of the MO, or if that's, and I don't know if I should say training. It seems like it's overkill, but
I can't believe it's the training. But I mean, if this happened at night and there were 5 shots being exchanged, then you've got it. Okay, he's being shot at, and he shoots back, and it's dark, and he can't see. This happened in daylight, as I understand it.
Yeah, no bullets were returning
exactly,
from the subject. Yeah,
he could see the people have testified that he stumbled, that he'd been hit twice in the arm, once in the chest, once in the hand, once in the wrist.
Yeah.
How dangerous is this unarmed teenager to a well-armed police officer in broad daylight? Yeah.
Well, thanks for your call, Bill, and bringing that up. And Dr. Greenfield, do you think that this is kind of emblematic of what's out there, what's happening out there, what the attitudes are?
I think that was a brilliant insight on a lot of levels. As you mentioned, issues of training and how young black men are perceived. And that impacts everything from the beginning of the situation to the end. Why he comes up on him and speaks. He admits he cursed at him. He cursed at Mike Brown. And so there's a way in which, perhaps even just that initial conversation went down to the decision that was made. Here he is, fully armed against an unarmed young person, multiple shots. Kid running away, still goes after him again. This prosecutor, and I think there's some great points that Bill sort of hinting at, the prosecutor did what all appears to be a pretty horrible job. No real cross-examination of Darren Wilson. Lots of questions that need to be asked, and I'm not even convinced that he was that interested in having this case go forward. And so from beginning to end, there's so many challenges. Think about Eric Garner. I'm in New York City right now, and Eric Garner a couple of months ago, allegedly selling loose cigarettes. And the police, and again, interesting example of hands up. He literally put his hands up and in defensive posture, taken to the ground, choked to death. And so we keep seeing this over and over again, where indeed decisions are being made out of the fear factor, where a whole bunch of other consequences take place that probably wouldn't happen with someone else. So I appreciate that insight. Everything from police training to the prosecution demonstrates that there's a whole bunch of flaws in here, and clearly that was an action that did not need to be taken.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, too, is that this grand jury, as I understand it, saw a lot more evidence than generally would be presented to a grand jury. But it's all presented by one side, by the prosecution in this case, and there's no there's no alternative to that. There's not a defense lawyer, for instance, in the room that is arguing, or offering counter evidence, that sort of thing. So it's not, you can't look at it as a trial per se. And, and I guess what worries me too is, that we live in a society where people like Rudy Giuliani, for instance, very well-respected figure who, infamously was talking on last Sunday about his white police officers, how when he was mayor of New York had to send white police officers into black neighborhoods because black Americans were killing each other, and he was taking credit for saving black lives, and that was, I thought it was jaw-dropping just to hear that guy saying what he was saying about this. But that attitude is pretty prevalent.
Absolutely. And certainly there are challenges in communities that have been that are disenfranchised. Certainly we're not arguing that there's no problems that people within a community need to address. But, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So we can handle that issue. But at the same time, this is the issue for today. The way in which brown and black men are perceived as threats, which lead to the kinds of behaviors that take away their lives. And Mike Brown should be right now getting ready to have Thanksgiving dinner with his family. And that'll never happen again. And so I think if nothing else, if we know some young men, particularly young men of color, that's what a lot of my students who have contacted me, and I've just said to them, I love you. And if there's nothing else, I hear you. I hear the pain. There's going to be some grieving that takes some time to feel like, once again, our lives are not valued. And just to say, I love you. Your life matters, and we will continue to struggle together. I think is some of those powerful things we can do in the meantime. And then we strategize. We strategize politically, economically. We do all kinds of educational campaigns. But today, we need to heal and really share some love for individuals who feel like they're constantly under attack. Need to know we've got their back.
Absolutely. And, we're talking about young people who, as you say, people like Rudy Giuliani want to lecture them and say, why don't you, pull yourself together and, do the right thing. And yet society looks at them not as people so much as gangsters, and that's
right. The view of being at risk as opposed to at success.
Right.
It's a very powerful thing. A dandelion is a weed or a flower, depends on how you look at it, and impacts everything you do to treat it. And so if we see young men as this sort of potential threat, we don't provide the same educational opportunities. We don't give them the same chances. We don't encourage them the same way. I see young men and young men of color as at success. And when we can shift that mindset to believe in them and encourage them, and that's going to take a lot of work, but hopefully, again, today can be the first day towards moving in that direction.
Dr. Derek Greenfield, great having you here on the program. Great to hear what you've got to say about this, because very important words. And we'll love to have you back here on the Joe Show again.
Please call me anytime. And again, thanks for your inspired work. All
right, take care. And Dr. Greenfield's book, once again, The Answer is in Your Hands. And check it out. Hunting season, deer hunting season. Look, his spoken word piece. It's pretty amazing. And we'll take a quick break. Back with more as we continue. What are your thoughts here on this day after we learned there will not be an indictment? I don't know if anybody was shocked by that. Unfortunately, but we'll be back here in just a moment and continue on the Joe Show. 360-7